Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to RANE Network's live stream this Friday, and I'm here with Nate, one of our Asia Pacific analysts, and my name is Ryan Bohl. I'm one of our senior Middle East and North Africa analysts, and we're going to be discussing kind of overlap between our areas of responsibility. And so we're starting off. We're looking at this recent survey that comes out of Dubai every year called the Arab Youth Survey, and it asks a lot of social questions. But one of them they ask is which country do Arab youth consider to be one of their top allies? And this year in 2023, the response was China, in a shift away from looking at both regional allies and the United States. So for the first time, the Chinese seem to be the biggest one that Arab youth consider to be a natural ally of their country. And this has got a lot of interesting social and geopolitical ramifications. But I'd like to kick it over to Nate to start us off with, like, what is the Chinese strategy in the region? Why might Arab youth think of them so favorably?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things happening recently in terms of China's presence in the Middle East. It's a fundamental change of tack from years past, where China has sort of had a hands-off relationship with the Middle East. Of course, the energy partnerships, petroleum products coming out of the Persian Gulf and into China is critical to its energy needs and its energy security. But for the most part, was happy to sort of ride along with the U.S. Security architecture in the region just to get some business done. And it's been, that's been a very productive relationship for a long time, but it didn't really expand much into more strategic considerations or political, very, very, very much just, straight business. This started to change 2019, 2020. And we're really seeing it start to come to fruition right now, where China's more involved. China wants to become more involved in the region to stabilize it, partially or largely because of its energy needs from the region. So it's undertaking pretty sweeping diplomatic efforts. Obviously, the Iran-Saudi Arabia rapprochement that was brokered by China is a huge deal. It's something, the United States has not accomplished, obviously. They put forward a recent peace plan for the Israel-Palestine conflict. Regardless of whether or not that goes anywhere, it shows that China wants to be a player in the Middle East, and they're making significant inroads, as we can tell from this poll. So to shoot it back over to you, Ryan, what do you think that these geopolitical rebalancing, I guess, of China in the Middle East, is that driving this spike in popularity, or what's going on there?
Well, I don't really know. I have to double check what dates the survey was done, because I would imagine that if this was done before the Iran-Saudi rapprochement, it's probably even higher now, because that's been well received across the region. Many Arab youth don't have any interest in being conscripted or going to war, and the region has obviously been racked with conflict for so long that particularly this younger generation, millennials and Gen Zers, pretty burned out on continued conflict. So I imagine that was well received amongst the same group. But I think also it has a lot to do with the fact, like you were talking about, they're seeing more Chinese investment. They're seeing more Chinese tourists. They're seeing more Chinese businesses and products in their daily lives. And especially places like the Gulf Arabs, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, etc. A lot of their products and lifestyles were dominated by products that came out of the West, and they're or Japan and South Korea. And increasingly, they're seeing more and more things come out of China. And they don't see things in the dichotomy that the U.S. does with products like Huawei and versus Apple. They see a convenient tool. And if the tool is affordable and it's easy for them to use, they don't see it through those political lenses. So that's what I imagine is part of this deeper driver. I'm wondering whether or not, on your side, Nate, if you think that Beijing is seeing these kinds of numbers and thinking to themselves, well, this is an incentive for us to get even more involved in the region. You mentioned Israel-Palestine, which has bedeviled so many American administrations, but so too did the Saudi-Iran conflict. And that was something that Beijing was able to broker at least a détente on. Where do you think China might go next within the region if they want to build on this positive momentum?
Sure. So China is very ambivalent to commit to make security commitments in the Middle East, like the United States has, or anywhere in the far abroad, frankly. So we still have to sort of wait and see how far China is willing to go in order to ensure security in the region. It's taking on some security risks that previously it had been adverse to. So it's becoming less risk averse in the region. In the event of, say, a terrorist attack or some such thing, then China will come under pressure to protect its interests, to protect its businesses and citizens that are in the Middle East and potentially victims of an attack. So that is why China was content to sort of free ride, if I can use that term, on the U.S. security architecture when it was very entrenched in the Middle East, because this is not something that they want to do. So there are trade-offs here. You have this increased security risk that comes with the increased investments and presence in the country, but not a willingness like the United States has to go on adventures abroad. And China very much ties this into its sort of the way it presents itself geopolitically to the rest of the world. Is we're not like the U.S. We don't intervene. We don't overthrow other countries. We don't meddle in internal affairs. But that policy and that stance might be put to the test if the security dynamics in the Middle East deteriorate. And given the history of that region, this is certainly a possibility. So we'll have to sort of wait and see how far China's actually willing to go to deal with some of the darker sides of dealing with the Middle East. But its approach is definitely different from the United States. It's based on peace, basically, countries coming together, erstwhile enemies or current enemies, to achieve stability that makes a more effective trade relationship and enhances energy security. So we'll see how far they're willing to go. And to shoot it back over to you, this contrast with China and the United States, the different approaches. There's been no Chinese military intervention. Do you think that might contribute to to China's popularity? That this contrast is quite stark.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's key, right? The United States has had to play the role of a proto-imperial power or a neo-imperial power, however you might like to phrase it. But the United States has had a long history of interventions that are based on its interests of energy security. And like you noted, China's been able to free ride off of that. Now, if the United States' retrenchment and withdrawal from the Middle East continues at scale, and there's a certain point where Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, etc., are all left more or less on their own without a guarantee of U.S. intervention, that's where I think we could see some interesting pressure points on Beijing. The global energy market has changed so much. The United States exports more energy or more oil than it does import anymore, and the market's complicated, so they still import from the Middle East. If there was a cutoff, the U.S. would have enough barrels of oil to meet its own needs and then some now, thanks to innovations like fracking. And that means that eventually that China may end up in the position where the U.S. has decided it really doesn't need to guarantee the Strait of Hormuz in the distant future. It really doesn't need to be concerned about Saudi's regime stability or Qatari security or things like that. And if the United States finds itself drawn into a great power conflict with, say, Iran or with Russia or China, or even if it faces a war with Iran, that deepens war wariness in this country and leads to an even deeper push to withdraw completely from the Middle East. That's where I wonder what would happen with China, whether or not, if it can't free ride anymore, how interventionist might it get? And we've seen, of course, a little bit of this. We've seen a secret naval base being built in the UAE that was the Americans outed and that the Emiratis then had to shut down. So we've seen signs that the Chinese are willing to experiment with deployments in this region. But so long as the Americans are still doing the job for them, they don't have to. It's just an open question of how much longer will the United States continue to do so. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. If we get to that moment where energy is no longer secured by the U.S. Navy, do you think that China would step up, and what might be the implications of something like that?
It would be a very big deal. I mean, a world-changing type event. If this is very strong in China's foreign policy, the anti-interventionist streak. So it would be a big reversal of that. That said, of course, I do think when the rubber hits the road and your energy security is under threat, you have new impetus to maybe readjust your policies. So the honest answer is I don't know. But if China wants energy security in the Middle East and the United States' pullout is more complete and they're not there to guarantee security, they're going to have to make this tough decision. I cannot forecast that right now, but I do think that choice is on the horizon, and the geopolitical dynamics of that time will probably play a role in which way it decides to go. I'll also add with the Strait of Hormuz, there's a concern in China that in the event of a war over Taiwan, that the United States Navy could easily just blockade the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca or a bunch of other key choke points that threaten to starve China's energy supply. Therefore, tightening relations with Gulf countries along that security dynamic could potentially lessen that risk in the long term. So I do think that's also something that Chinese policymakers are thinking about when it comes to the Gulf.
Yep, absolutely. And great power conflict always looms on the back of many of our forecasts, especially our longer forecasts like one of these. Well, Nate, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in today. If you want to learn more about MENA-China relations, and of course, U.S.-China relations, please visit www.ranenetwork.com and subscribe.
Thank you.